You've been lied to your entire life. Not maliciously, just consistently. Hollywood did it first, and then every Western novel, every theme park, every romanticized retelling did it again. They gave you the wide-open plains, the rugged cowboy with a square jaw and clean hands, the saloon full of people who somehow smell like leather and adventure. They gave you the myth. I'm going to give you the reality. The year is 1876. You are standing on the main street of Deadwood, Dakota Territory. The Black Hills gold rush is in full swing. Thousands of men and a smaller number of women have poured into this valley chasing a fortune. The town shouldn't exist. The land was still legally protected as Sioux territory under the Fort Laramie Treaty. Nobody cared. Gold was here, and where there is gold, Americans will go, treaty or no treaty. What they found when they got here was not the frontier of legend. It was an open-air disaster, a makeshift collection of tents and green lumber shacks, with no sewage system, no clean water, no medical infrastructure worth the name. A place where your neighbor's waste ran downhill into the same stream you drank from. A place where a small cut on your hand could kill you inside a week. For the next 15 minutes, I want you to live in that world.
Just breathe.
Not the postcard version,
Hold on.
the real one. The one that smelled like rot and tasted like death and moved fast, because if you didn't move fast, the town would bury you. And it buried a lot of people. Still with me? Good, because we're just getting started. You've just arrived after 3 weeks in a wagon. 3 weeks. You slept on wooden boards, ate hardtack and salted pork that was already turning, and drank whatever water you could find along the trail. You haven't bathed once. Your clothes are stiff with dried sweat and trail dust. Your boots are caked with a mixture of mud and animal waste from every camp you stopped at along the way. You don't notice your own smell anymore. The human nose adapts to constant odors within a few days. It's a survival mechanism that evolution built in long before the Wild West. In 1876 Deadwood, it was one of the most useful things your body could do. The town greets you with a wall of stench. There are no sidewalks, just a wide dirt track that turns into a river of mud every time it rains. And in that mud is everything. Horse manure piled several inches deep in some stretches, human waste from chamber pots emptied out of windows and doorways, rotting food scraps, dead rats, blood from the butcher at the end of the street. You walk through all of it. Everybody does. There is no other option. The buildings pressing in on both sides are rough-cut lumber, most of it still green. Green lumber warps as it dries. Doors stop closing. Walls develop gaps. Wind comes through. Rain comes through. In winter, and the Black Hills winters are genuinely brutal, cold comes through. And there is nothing between you and it except a thin wood wall and whatever fire you can keep going. By mid-afternoon, you're thirsty. Of course you are. You've been working in the sun for hours, and the only thing resembling a break was a handful of dry biscuit at noon. So you go looking for water. Your options are grim. Whitewood Creek runs through Deadwood. In theory, it's your water source. In practice, it's also where the mining operations upstream have been dumping their tailings, which are laced with arsenic and cyanide from the ore processing. It's where animals drink and defecate. It's where the runoff from the main street eventually flows. In the summer heat, sections of it are barely moving, warm and opaque. People drank it anyway, because what was the alternative? Die of thirst today, or gamble on dying of cholera next week. Most people chose the gamble. Cholera didn't have a proper name here. People called it camp fever or mountain sickness. You'd wake up feeling slightly off. By noon, violent diarrhea and vomiting. By evening, severe dehydration. By the following morning, if there was a following morning, you were either recovering through sheer luck or you were dead. The mechanism wasn't understood. Nobody in 1876 Deadwood connected the sick man in Tent 7 to the water he drank from the same creek as Tent 7's neighbor. The practical solution most men had landed on by accident was whiskey. The alcohol killed a portion of the pathogens. The saloon, for this reason among others, was genuinely the safest place in town to hydrate. This is not a joke. This is documented frontier medicine. Let's talk about your body. Not your frontier spirit. Not your rugged individualism. Your actual, physical body. And what it was experiencing on a daily basis in 1876 Deadwood. Bathing was not a weekly practice. For most miners and laborers, a full bath happened roughly once a month, and that was considered reasonable. Some men went an entire mining season, 6 to 8 months, without immersing themselves in clean water a single time. There were bathhouses in some of the larger western towns, but they charged money. The water was shared between customers without being changed, and by the time the fifth man got in, the water was black. You paid to sit in someone else's filth and considered yourself clean afterward. Lice were so universal. They were invisible in the historical record. Diaries from the period mentioned them the way modern people might mention mosquitoes, an annoyance so constant it barely warrants comment. They lived in hair, in beards, in clothing, in the straw bedding that most men slept on. Fleas were in the horses, in the dogs, in the dirt floors of every building. Everyone itched, no one remarked on it. Your teeth told the story of your life in the most literal possible way. By 30, most working men in the West had lost several. By 40, if they made it that far, the mouth was a patchwork of gaps and pain. There were no dentists in the conventional sense. There were barbers and blacksmiths who would pull a tooth with forceps when the infection became unbearable. No anesthetic. You bit down on a leather strap and they yanked. The lucky ones passed out. A significant number of men died not from bullets or mining accidents, but from untreated dental abscesses that spread into the jaw, the skull, the bloodstream. Mining in 1876 meant spending your days underground, in shafts dug by hand in black powder, breathing silica dust from the broken rock. The dust settled in your lungs and stayed there permanently. Silicosis developed slowly. You'd notice a cough in year 2, blood in year 4, and by year 6 or 7 you were essentially drowning in your own lung tissue as it hardened and scarred. There was no treatment. There was no diagnosis. It was just called miner's lung and understood to be part of the job. Cuts were a different kind of roulette. A deep gash from a pickaxe or a saw, and there were many. Because you were doing dangerous physical labor in poor light with rudimentary tools could be a death sentence. Without antibiotics, without effective antiseptic, infection set in fast. Infection became sepsis. Sepsis became gangrene. Gangrene meant amputation. Amputation in the Wild West was performed in whatever space was available, often a saloon table, often by a man whose medical training was minimal at best. The procedure was fast by necessity, because speed was the only anesthetic available. Survival rates for limb amputations on the frontier hovered around 50%, not because the surgery itself was necessarily fatal, but because post-operative infection, shock, and blood loss killed roughly half the patients in the following days. You went in for a leg and flipped a coin on whether you walked out. The standard diet of a Deadwood miner in 1876 was beans, salt pork, hardtack biscuit, and coffee. Every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The beans were often undercooked because firewood was expensive and rationed. The salt pork was frequently rancid. Salt was a preservative, not a guarantee. The biscuit was dense enough to chip a tooth, which, given what we just discussed about dentistry, was its own problem. Fresh meat was available, but dangerous. Without refrigeration, no ice, no cold storage meat hung in the open air in summer temperatures, attracting flies within minutes. Maggots appeared within hours. The standard practice was to cut away the visible spoilage and eat what was underneath on the logic that the heat had cooked whatever was in there. This logic was wrong in ways that the men applying it didn't have the bacteriology to understand. Food poisoning was so common it was considered a baseline condition of frontier life rather than an illness. Scurvy appeared regularly in communities cut off from fresh produce for extended periods. The gums would swell and bleed. Teeth would loosen and fall out of otherwise intact mouths. Old wounds would reopen as the connective tissue broke down. Bones would ache. Men who had survived months of hard labor would find themselves unable to get up in the morning, their bodies literally falling apart from the inside because they hadn't eaten a vegetable in 4 months. The solution, citrus fruit, which prevents and reverses scurvy, rapidly existed but was scarce and expensive in interior towns. For the cost of a crate of lemons, you could buy a gun. Most men bought the gun. Let's dismantle the biggest myth of all. Violence in the Wild West was real. It was not rare, but it was responsible for a fraction of the total deaths in places like Deadwood. The gunfighter who died in a dramatic duel at high noon is a great story. He is not a representative data point. What actually killed people in massive, documented, undeniable numbers was disease. Specifically, tuberculosis. Consumption, as it was called, spread through the air in enclosed spaces. It fed on exactly the conditions that defined frontier life: overcrowding, malnutrition, cold, poor ventilation, exhausted immune systems. You'd develop a cough. The cough would become persistent, then productive, then bloody. The disease could take years to kill, which meant you were infectious for years. Coughing in the same bunkhouse, the same saloon, the same cramped tent as everyone you knew. In communities with no quarantine protocol and no understanding of airborne transmission, tuberculosis moved through a mining camp like fire through dry grass. Typhoid fever came from the same contaminated water we've already discussed. It killed more American soldiers in the Indian Wars than combat did, a fact the military's own records confirm, and a ratio that held in civilian frontier populations. Smallpox arrived with migrant waves and found populations with inconsistent vaccination coverage. Measles, which modern people associate with childhood inconvenience, killed adults who had never been exposed to it as children, and it killed them efficiently. Then there was syphilis, and the frontier had an epidemic of it that went largely unnamed in polite historical accounts, because naming it required discussing how it spread. The male-to-female ratio in Deadwood in 1876 was approximately 15 or 20 to 1. Women who arrived were immediately subject to enormous social and economic pressure, and a significant number ended up in the commercial sex trade, whether by genuine choice, desperation, or coercion in various proportions. The syphilis they encountered had no effective treatment. The mercury-based remedies used at the time were nearly as toxic as the disease itself. Mercury poisoning produced tooth loss, neurological damage, and kidney failure. Many men preferred to simply ignore the symptoms. Untreated syphilis progresses in stages over years. The tertiary phase attacks the central nervous system. Hallucinations, paranoia, grandiose delusions, progressive dementia, physical paralysis. A significant number of men in frontier towns who were considered crazy or described in contemporary accounts as erratic, violent, or delusional were almost certainly in the late stages of neurosyphilis. Nobody knew. It wasn't diagnosed. It was just the way some men went. The women who built the Wild West are among the most systematically erased figures in American historical memory. The ones who ended up in commercial sex work, and there were thousands across the frontier towns, had a life expectancy after entering the trade of roughly 23 years from the time they started. Not 23 years of total life, 23 years remaining. Many were already in their teens or early 20s when they began. Do that math. Violence was constant. Disease was constant. Addiction was the coping mechanism of choice, because morphine and laudanum tincture of opium were sold over the counter at every general store in the West, no prescription required, at prices a working person could afford. Dependency wasn't stigmatized because it wasn't understood. It was just the thing you took when everything hurt. And in 1876 Deadwood, everything hurt. And childbirth for any woman on the frontier was one of the most dangerous events in human life. No hospital, no sterile environment, no trained obstetrician. Attended by a neighbor, a midwife with practical but informal training, or sometimes alone. Puerperal fever postpartum infection killed a significant proportion of frontier mothers within days of delivery. The baby would survive. The mother would develop a fever on day 2, organ failure by day 4, and be buried by the end of the week. The shootings happened, but the most significant violence of the 1,876 American West was not random, not individual, and not glamorous. The same year Deadwood was booming on illegally occupied Sioux land, the United States Army was conducting organized military campaigns against the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations across the plains. The Battle of Little Bighorn happened in June of 1876, one of the rare moments when the outcome was different from the pattern that preceded and followed it. For every Little Bighorn, there were dozens of engagements that ended in massacre, displacement, and the deliberate destruction of the food sources, primarily the buffalo herds that indigenous communities depended on for survival. This was not frontier chaos. This was federal policy. The gold in the Black Hills was the economic justification for breaking a treaty that was only 8 years old. The violence was the instrument. The dispossession was the goal. The next time you turn on a tap and clean water comes out treated, pressurized, tested, safe, I want you to hold that moment for just a second, longer than usual, because that water represents a fight that lasted centuries. The fight to understand that invisible things in dirty water kill people. The fight to build sewage systems and water treatment plants and the bureaucratic infrastructure to maintain them. The fight to develop vaccines, antibiotics, antiseptics to understand germ theory at all, which wasn't established until the 1860s and wasn't widely accepted for decades after that. The people of Deadwood in 1876 were not weaker than you. They were not stupider. They were ordinary human beings operating without the tools that make modern life survivable. The average life expectancy in a frontier mining town was under 40 years. In the United States today, it is nearly 79. That gap is not genetics. It is not willpower. It is sanitation. It is vaccination. It is the understanding that the invisible world of microorganisms is as dangerous as any gunfighter, and far less romantic. The Wild West wasn't romantic. It was a rolling humanitarian crisis that we called civilization because we didn't have a more honest word for it. The men who survived it were lucky, as much as tough. The ones we remember as legends are the exceptions. The rule was a shallow grave somewhere in the Dakota Territory, unmarked, unmourned, forgotten inside a generation. Appreciate your shower. Appreciate your tap water. Appreciate the fact that a cut on your hand is an inconvenience and not a potential death sentence. Because for most of human history, and for the people of Deadwood in 1876, it absolutely was. What other era do you want torn apart? Drop it in the comments, and if you made it this far, you already know what to do.